We are live. Welcome, everyone, to episode 37 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. This is actually part two of my visit with the FCPA professor, Mike Kohler. In episode one, we talked about some of the things that were on his mind from the middle of, or rather in Q1 of 2014 and some of the trends he saw in 2013. We also talked about his FCPA video training course that he's recently partnered with the company M-Train to release. In part two here, we're going to talk about a couple of things that we debated, or perhaps debate is not the right word, we both posted about in the first part of 2014, and we wanted to actually have a debate on it. And maybe to set it up a little bit, I wrote a post where I opined that I believe the main reason for the increase, indeed the explosion, increase in FCPA enforcement starting about 2004 was the Bush administration's view that corruption was a component of terrorism. And as such, they looked around to try to find laws that were already on the books after 9/11, which would help fight in the war against terrorism. So the professor and I had a dialogue via email, and it was a very good dialogue, and we decided that we might express our views about what led to this enforcement on a podcast, and we hope that you will both enjoy that. So I've set it up. Do you want me to go further, Mike, or do you want to take it from there?
Well, Tom, let me just disagree with you to begin with. This whole notion about an explosion of enforcement. Now, I completely agree that if you look at FCPA enforcement during the 36 years of its existence on a graph, there is a general upward trend. In any particular year, over the last 5-7 years, there may be dips and valleys, but I completely agree with the upward trend. Now, let's take a step back, though, and recognize that even with this upward trend, in any particular year, there is anywhere from 10 to 15 core enforcement actions. Now, while 10 to 15 is more than 0, is more than 5, is 10 to 15 enforcement actions truly a lot? When you consider that every single U.S. company is subject to the FCPA, when you consider that there are over 1,000 foreign companies subject to the FCPA, and when you theoretically at least consider, because of the DD3 prong of the FCPA, that at least conceivably every company in the world, if certain jurisdictional elements have been met, are potentially subject to the FCPA. So I think people need to take a step back and say, okay, there may be a general upward increase, but the sky is not falling here. And using terms like explosion, I'm just not certain I agree with that particular word.
All right. Well, we'll take that as my word then. So, and my comparison is post-04 and pre-04. So I absolutely agree with what you said about the dips and downs and ups and don'ts during that time. It may go up, it may go down. It may have more individual actions based on core enforcement actions, or it may not. But I just look at sort of pre-04 and post-04 and wonder what changed.
Okay. So there are a number of things that are based upon facts that we know. First of all, you have to recognize that approximately 35% of FCPA enforcement actions since 2007, that's a big chunk, are based upon just 3 historical events. The first historical event is there are approximately 20 FCPA enforcement actions based upon the Iraq Oil for Food program. And we know why that happened. All that happened prior to 9/11. There's no causal connection, despite George Bush's perhaps best efforts to relate Saddam Hussein to terrorism. or anything like that. So we know why the Iraqi oil for food cases happened. There was the Volcker report. This all predates 9/11. Furthermore, another big bulk of FCPA enforcement actions, indeed many cases, approximately I think 5 of the top 10, involved conduct at Bonny Island, Nigeria, the Bonny Island cases. And we know why those happened. A French national walked into a French magistrate's office and says, "Hey, I got something to tell you about Bonny Island." And a third big bulk of cases, approximately 8 of them, are regarding oil and gas services companies and their use of panopena. So in answering the question of why has there been this general increase, you have to start off by recognizing that approximately 35% of enforcement activity over the last 5 or 6 years was just based upon these 3 events. Okay, so now you ask, okay, why did all the other cases happen? Well, as you know, Tom, well over 50% of these cases result in corporate voluntary disclosures. So unless you can craft an argument for why FCPA lawyers, because of terrorism, are disclosing these cases, you do have to accept the fact that 50% of enforcement actions, corporate enforcement actions, are the result of corporate disclosure. And then we just need to accept and acknowledge some very basic facts here. The first one is incredibly basic, and that is in 1998, the statute changed. DD3 prong of the FCPA was added to the FCPA. And the DOJ has brought several cases under the DD3 prong of the statute, both against companies and against individuals. Even more basic is there's been an increase in international business activity in the last 10 years. And to state the obvious, the more companies that are doing business in overseas jurisdictions, including high-risk jurisdictions, you're going to see more FCPA enforcement activity, logically. So for instance, last year in the S&P 500, 50% of the sales of S&P 500 companies were non-U.S. sales. That compares with 30% approximately 5 years ago. That's a big jump. And just like you would expect to see more traffic tickets, the more drivers there are on the road, I think you would expect to see more FCPA enforcement actions, the more companies that are doing business in overseas jurisdictions. So I've been talking for a while, so I'll put it in your court now.
Sure. On the coming from an international focused city, we have done business in Houston internationally since I've been a lawyer, and I don't really see an uptick in the international component as much as you do. But to your point about the self-disclosures by lawyers, here's where I differ on your analysis. I think the department was looking around for some laws because they viewed 9/11 as obviously terrorism, but conceptually corruption as a component of terrorism. Loose borders, passport controls, ability to bribe to get through. All of those things were part of what led to the people being able to get into the United States. And the Bush administration wanted to do everything they could with what was on the books to fight that. That was the intellectual shift. Now, once they made that intellectual shift, you didn't talk about some of the things I expected you to talk about, which was the rise in...
I'm simply giving you a chance to chime in here.
The rise in DPAs and NPAs, their development and their use. Sarbanes-Oxley requirement to self-disclose. You did hit upon the self-disclosure part, so perhaps we could tie that in. But I think once they made that shift, we saw sort of a change when we went from Peter Clark to Mark Mendelson, and a dedication of resources to the FCPA unit and much more ramped up enforcement there. That was what the change was. Now, you've come in and pointed out not the development of DPAs, because those existed before, but really the plethora of use of DPAs since the '04 timeframe has become very prevalent in the FCPA world. I think all of those factors have driven, and it's now become a self-fulfilling prophecy on increase, but it's also become the reason there are more disclosures now. But that initial shift was somebody made the connection of corruption to terrorism, and that's the part that I had never seen before.
Tom, there's no doubt that terrorists are corrupt people. I mean, I'm not trying to suggest otherwise, but to suggest that the reason we find ourselves in this new era of FCPA enforcement is because of this terrorism linkage, it's just pure speculation. And let's look at some actual factual data again. And indeed, let's look at actual statements by Department of Justice officials themselves for why FCPA enforcement has increased. Now, as you know, DPAs and MPAs are obviously relevant to this. DPAs and MPAs were first used in the FCPA enforcement context in 2004. And it stands to reason that the more options the Department of Justice and now the SEC, because they figured out, hey, it's sort of fun enforcing the FCPA in the absence of judicial scrutiny. Give me one of those, right? They're using MPAs and DPAs now as well. It stands to reason there's going to be more enforcement. And Mark Mendelson himself has said that NPAs and DPAs are one of the reasons why you're seeing more cases. The OECD, in its 2010 report of U.S. enforcement of the FCPA, said, and I'm quoting virtually verbatim here, it's quite obvious that MPAs and DPAs are one of the reasons for the increase in FCPA enforcement. Greg Andres, the person who was the face of the DOJ at both the 2010 Senate hearing and 2011 House hearing, was directly asked this question. And the only specific thing he provided was Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, Sarbanes-Oxley was passed in 2002 in the wake of Enron WorldCom. It had nothing to do with terrorism. But more importantly, and this gets to why 2004 is so important, the internal controls provisions of Sarbanes-Oxley did not become effective until November of 2004. And what the internal control provisions of Sarbanes-Oxley required is essentially for corporations to take a greater interest in their far-flung subsidiaries. And as a practical matter, it created an entire new job category within a corporation of going out and testing controls. And again, the DOJ representative at the hearing specifically said that SOX was the major reason why there has been an increase in FCPA enforcement. So whether it's very practical reasons like the increase in international business activity, and I know you're in Houston, the oil and gas companies were always doing business overseas, but your mom and pop manufacturing facilities, your pharmaceutical companies, it's really only been in the last 7 to 10 years in which they've increased their presence in foreign countries. And it's a fact that there has been this increase in international business activity. It's a fact that in 2004, MPAs and DPAs were introduced to the FCPA context. It's a fact that in 2004, SOX 404 provisions became effective.
And see, it's not that I'm saying terrorists are corrupt or not corrupt. It's that corruption is a strategy and tool of terrorists. And I would point you to the Kenyan Mall massacre, where it was clear that both the individuals involved in that massacre and the arms that they used came into Kenya because of Kenya's propensity for corruption, and they were able to bribe and get them across the border. Now, in 9/11, I'm not suggesting that U.S. Customs agents were bribed. What I'm suggesting was that the terrorists were able to get out of the countries in the Middle East because corruption allowed them to get the documents, falsified documents, to get to the United States. So I think that's the change that was made. The things that you have detailed, you actually quoted, I think, Mark Mendelson, where he said Sarbanes-Oxley was one of the reasons. DPAs and NPAs are one of the reasons. But I think the underlying reason of why the shift was made was this view, correctly, that I would say, that terrorism is a component of crime from a continuum of terrorism, armed robbery, and then corruption, that the Bush administration wanted to try to use all available tools to fight, and now it's part of our domestic policy.
I mean, I don't even know why we're talking about this Kenya Mall massacre. It has absolutely nothing to do with the topic here. Of course, terrorists are corrupt. And furthermore, there are actually very few, relatively speaking, FCPA enforcement actions concerning Middle Eastern countries. Most of the enforcement activity is not in countries you would typically associate with terrorism, whether that's China. There's been a number of enforcement actions in Argentina and Latin American countries. I hear you, Tom. I just don't agree with you, and in fact, I think you're speculating and ignoring the facts and the very practical reasons, and we haven't even gotten to the provocative reason for why there's an increase in FCPA enforcement.
That's the second time you said there's no debate or no discussion or no, we're not disagreeing that terrorists are corrupt. That's not the point I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to say is that corruption is a component of terrorism. And if you accept that it's a component of terrorism, then you need to use, and you can use, the tools that are available to you to fight corruption. The Bush administration looked around and saw a domestic U.S. law designed to fight corruption.
And what is your support for that statement?
It's very simple that I finally now understand that intellectual linkage between the two. And it seems to me that if corruption is a part of terrorism, and I now believe it is, that it follows that if you have a domestic law that fights corruption, you can use that to enforce it. And that's what has led to the use of the other tools that I think you've correctly articulated.
So the reason we're not prosecuting, the reason there's FCPA enforcement activities concerning providing karaoke bars and spa treatments to Chinese doctors is because we're trying to fight terrorism?
The intellectual linkage between corruption and terrorism led to this increase, which led to down the slippery slope to where we are in some of these enforcement actions now. It's not that corruption leads to a spa treatment, which leads to terrorism, but certainly corruption does lead to terrorism. If you're going to fight corruption and you have a domestic law that fights it, you will enforce that action using the tools that you've articulated.
We know why the vast majority of FCPA enforcement actions occurred, and I just stepped us through that.
You stepped through an answer to a second part of the equation, but what I didn't see before was the disparate parts coming together to make that increase. I now believe that corruption is what was the shift, and seeing corruption as a part of terrorism. And then all of the things that you have delineated and talked about, I agree, have led to where we are now. But I think that shift was made when somebody put together corruption and terrorism.
Well, I agree that corruption and terrorism go hand in hand, but I respectfully disagree that the general increase in FCPA enforcement since 2004 has anything to do with the U.S. fight against terrorism, no matter how broadly that's defined.
You know, that's as good a point to perhaps end our discussion and ask that if there are any of our listeners out there who have any thoughts on this. I have not put this question to Mark Mendelson or Peter Clark or Chuck DeRoss or really anyone else at the department, but I would certainly love to have some authoritative comments on it.
We haven't even talked about the provocative reason here, and let's just quote, a former assistant chief of DOJ FCPA enforcement, quote, "The DOJ sees a profitable program here and it's going to ride that horse until it can't ride it anymore." Let's face it, I mean, when I say this, people think I'm being provocative, but everyone knows it in their gut of gut. FCPA enforcement is good for this niche industry. The more FCPA enforcement there is, it's good for certain segments of the bar, the compliance community, the accounting industry, and we cannot ignore that fact. I'm not saying that's the sole reason. I'm not even saying that's the primary reason. But if we're looking at the general big picture here, it's certainly part of the analysis and the discussion.
I have to say I would categorically reject that statement for being what brought the shift. I will not reject that statement for what's happened since then, but I would say that I don't find that persuasive as to what happened circa 2004 going forward. I don't think somebody sat there and figured out, we've got all these tools, we'll make all this money. I'm not going to, that may have happened afterwards, it may be a result of it, but I don't think that's what made the shift. So that's why I would not say that's what caused the shift.
Yeah, just so we're clear, I agree with you. I'm not putting this as the primary reason. There are many other primary reasons, such as the increase in international business, such as MPAs, DPAs, such as the change in the statute, such as SOX 404. But I agree with you, and it sounds like we agree that this has to be part of the relevant mix of information when people are asking, why are we in this new era of FCPA enforcement?
Well, we'll save that part for another day then.
No, I'd be interested in hearing from others about this as well. I've asked this question numerous times, including to people who have just recently exited DOJ FCPA enforcement, and I'm not finding any support for this. And maybe the support is out there. If the people who were in the inside and know want to articulate that, there are two platforms available, your website, my website. Let's have a public discussion about this.
Well, I would certainly welcome that, and as the professor said, we both love to have some posts or calls or emails, or if you want to be interviewed, go that far, I'd certainly be up for that. So if there's anybody out there listening with greater insights or even other insights, we'd love to hear from you. Mike, as always, great to debate with you. Really have enjoyed this. I hope the listeners have enjoyed our two-part visit with the FCPA professor. So if you did not catch, I think, episode 36, go back and listen to that. And till next time, could you tell us, or could you tell our listeners if they want to visit with you, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, my website is fcpaprofessor.com, and I can be reached at fcpaprofessor@gmail.com.
All right. Well, we will look forward to your next entry into the world of FCPA Inc. And as a teaser, I know you've written a book, and hopefully it will be out sometime so that we can put in front of us some of your thoughts that you've articulated on this and other forums. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.